Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the licensing panel on Wednesday, the 1st of June at the Breckland Conference Centre. We've had the fire alarm test, and as this meeting is being recorded and live streamed, could I also remind members and those wishing to speak to make sure that you turn your microphones on when you wish to speak and turn them off when finished. And could you make sure your mobile phones are turned off? On your Toblerone, as we call them at the front, the button that you press to speak has got MIC underneath it. I'm the chairman of the licensing panel, Marion Chapman-Allen, and I introduce my panel members, Keith Martin and Tristan Ashby. On my left, I have the council solicitor, Sarah Wostenholm-Smythe, and we have our substitute member, Linda Monument, who would you like to remain in the meeting, Linda? Okay, thank you. Just to remind everyone that we'll be following the procedures which are on page 3 of the agenda pack, and as follows. There'll be a presentation by officers of their report, then questions to the officer by members on policy, a presentation by the applicant, their opportunity to give a statement on the application, to call witnesses and produce documents relevant to the application, questions to the applicant by members, and then questions by interested parties and responsible authorities may also question the applicant, then a presentation by interested parties or responsible authorities, opening, call witnesses and produce documents relative to the representations made and the licensing objectives, questions to interested parties, responsible authorities by members, and questions to interested parties, responsible authorities by the applicant. Then a summary by the applicant. We will then have advice from officers on policy and or the solicitor on law and jurisdiction. Then members of the panel, the legal advisor and the democratic services officer will remain in the room, and all other parties will be asked to move to the foyer of the committee suite. The panel will discuss the application and consider all the information given, both in person and in the report, and make a determination on the application. If further clarification is required, all other parties will be asked to return to the room. Then the applicant and members of the panel will return, and the decision, including the reasons, is announced. The decision and the reasons will be provided to all parties in writing within 5 working days of the meeting. So I shall start the meeting with the apologies. Okay. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Could we just go around the room, starting with Councillor Borrett, just asking you to introduce yourselves.
Good morning. I'm Councillor Bill Borrett, and I'm the local member for Beela.
Good morning. I'm Robert Pillar. I'm the chair of the parish meeting for Beela.
Thank you, Mr. Pillar.
Good morning. I'm Michael Hohogger. I am one of the objectors. I'm also church warden at the Beela Church.
Could you give me your surname again, sir?
Hohogger.
Hohogger.
H-O-G-G-E-R.
Lovely, thank you.
Good morning, I'm Mike White. I'm a resident of Beela and an objector.
And the next person?
Good morning, my name is Mary Hawkins. I'm a resident at Beela on the Beela estate, and I'm an objector.
Thank you.
Good morning, Aubrey Hawkins, also a resident on the estate and an objector.
Thank you, Mr. Hawkins. Oh, sorry, I couldn't see you. You're tucked away in the corner.
That's right. Someone would turn the microphone on. Good morning, Ben and Helen Budworth, Beela Hall, both objectors.
Thank you, Mr. Budworth. And if we could go up to the top of the room, please.
Good morning, I'm April Medler, daughter of Andreas Medler, the campsite owner, applicant.
Thank you, Ms Medler.
Hello there, my name's Andreas Reginald Madler. I'm a campsite owner and the applicant.
Thank you, Mr Medler. And we have opposite, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, good morning. My name's Paul Bajaya. I'm licensing officer for Brecon Council.
And good morning, I'm Josie Hoven. I'm the senior licensing officer for Brecon Council.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, everyone. So now we can go into the meeting, Julie. Do we have an apologies?
Thank you, Chair. No, we have no apologies.
And declarations of interest? Could I ask members if they have any interest to declare? Nope. Procedures. I've already mentioned these earlier, so we will carry on with the panel meeting. Could I now ask Josie Hoven, the Senior Licensing Officer, to present the report?
Thank you, Chairman. The purpose of today's meeting is to consider the application for a premises licence under the Licensing Act 2003 for Beela Country Park Caravan and Campsite, Dereham Road, Beela. And the background information is that the Breckland Council licensing team received an application for a new premises licence for Beela Country Park Caravan and Campsite on the 14th of April 2022. The applicant is Mr. Andreas Medler. A copy of the application form is attached as Appendix A. The application requests the following activities: alcohol on sales Monday to Sunday from 10 AM to 2300, plays, film, boxing, wrestling, live music, recorded music, performance of dance and anything of a similar description outdoors Monday to Sunday, 10 AM to 2300. Please note that there is an automatic entitlement for live or recorded music from 0800 to 2300 Monday to Sunday under the Deregulation Act 2015. So as long as conditions are met in the Deregulation Act, those will apply. The application has been advertised in accordance with the regulations. Responses were received from the following responsible authorities: the police and planning and EP. Sorry, that was missed off of the report, but Environmental Protection did respond. Copies of their responses are attached as Appendix B. Responses as objections to the application were received from Parish Council, Ward Member and a number of local residents. Copies of these representations are attached as Appendix C. The majority of objections are on the grounds of prevention of public nuisance and the prevention of crime and disorder. A further response in support of the application was received, attached as Appendix D. A Google map showing the site and surrounding area is attached as Appendix E. Options available to the members today are that members have the following options in accordance with Section 18 of the Licensing Act 2003. You may grant the licence subject to conditions as are consistent with the operating schedule accompanying the application. You may modify the conditions of the licence, altering or omitting or adding to them. You may exclude any of the licensable activities to which the application relates. You may refuse to specify a person in the licence as the premises supervisor, or you may refuse to grant the application. The licensing panel are asked to note that they may not reject the application merely because it's desirable to do so. It must actually be necessary in order to promote the licensing objectives. Members of the licensing panel are asked to make a decision at the end of the hearing after all parties have been given the opportunity to speak. Members must give full reasons for their decision. The application must be considered in accordance with the Licensing Act 2003 and subsequent regulations, the guidance issued under Section 182 of the Licensing Act 2003 and Brecon Council's Statement of Licensing Policy to ensure that a lawful decision is made. The implications have been considered. The constitution and legal, the procedure for preparing for and holding a hearing are set out in legislation, and the decision of the licensing panel is subject to appeal at Magistrates Court. The prevention of crime and disorder is one of the 4 licensing objectives being taken into consideration by the licensing panel, and the human rights are listed at 5.3. So it remains to say the final recommendation is that the members of the licensing panel determine the application for a new premises licence for Beela Country Park Caravan and Campsite at Dereham Road, Beela, in accordance with the Licensing Act 2003 and subsequent regulations, the guidance issued under Section 182 of the Licensing Act 2003 and Breckland Council's Statement of Licensing Policy.
Thank you, Josie. Keith, do you have any questions for Josie? Tristan? Josie, I've just got one question which you may be able to clear up. It says on one of the objection letters that Mr. Medler is currently subject to enforcement notice from Breckland Council. Could you confirm if that's true or deny it if it's not?
I'm not able to give that response, but I do believe that the solicitor has looked into that matter.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I can confirm that no enforcement notice has been served.
Thank you, Sarah. Well, that was my only question. Josie, could I now ask Mr. Medler, the applicant, to make his presentation, call witnesses and or produce documents relevant to the application?
Hello there. I'm going to ask my daughter to speak on behalf of me, but also, can we just hand out some of our site rules, please?
If anyone would like a copy, that,
Which?
yeah.
Yes, Mr. Medler, if you'd like to give them to the clerk, I'm quite. Sorry? Right. Councillor Borrett and members of the public, because this is a late document, I've been advised by our solicitor that we have to have the consent of all parties before the document can be distributed. So do I have your consent or your objection?
We don't know what it is.
Well, absolutely, Councillor Borrett. Well, I would suggest, Mr. Bedler, if you could show it to the solicitor first of all,
Yep. that's fine.
and just let her briefly cast her eyes over it. Could you turn your microphone off?
Sorry.
Thank you.
I can confirm it's a list of site rules, so dealing with speed limit, wooded areas, dogs, barbecues, insurance, tidiness, ball games, children on site, and so on and so forth. Doesn't seem controversial, but obviously it's a matter for you.
Does it actually? How long is it being
That's a question you could ask the applicant at the appropriate time. Thank you. And
Julie, could you be kind enough to give them to the members, please? Thank you. Thanks, Julie. Ms. Medler, would you like to continue with the presentation?
Will do, thank you.
Hello, my name is April Medler, and my dad Andreas has asked me to read this statement and point out some facts in relation to the small minority of objections that have arose from a closed-door parish council meeting where no invitation was given to allow someone to give representation at that meeting to discuss the licensing application. Andreas is a custodial to approximately 340 acres, 1/5 of the parish of Bela. Over the course of about 20 years, Andreas has planted over 3,000 hedging plants, 250 trees, removed over 2 tons of barbed wire and 100 concrete posts from wooded areas left over from World War II, cleared up an array of debris from over the land, and rebuilt over 30 metres of the park wall with no cost to anyone other than himself. Andreas's intentions have been good and always will be, even though one or two are trying to portray something different. Andreas could have rallied around and collected 10, 20, 500 supporting letters, but feels it would be unfair to put upon people over a handful of objections that are generic and say more about the people writing them than himself and a family-run business. But at the same time, would like to bring some of the content of these objections forward without going into too much detail and wasting too much time. These handful of objections are derived from a private parish council meeting held at Beela Hall that was referenced to the licence application, but believed it turned into a kangaroo court. I believe no other objections have been raised from anyone else, apart from a few residents who attended this private meeting at Beela Hall, which has been taken to the extreme under the advice from Bill Borrett. That is in turn led to this hearing as planned by them at this meeting. If you wouldn't mind, I'd just like to reference some of the objections, 3 of the objections, and some of the content, if that's okay.
Ms Medler,
Yeah.
what you're referring to, is it in the bundle of documents regarding the hearing?
It's
Because
it is literally the objections submitted to yourselves from Beela Parish meeting. So
There's some of the content that I'd just like to draw the attention to. That's perhaps not relevant to the licence applications, etc.
no, that's absolutely fine, Mr Medler.
these
because
are all in
I
their
don't-
applications for everyone.
I was going to say, we don't
Okay.
actually have a copy of the minutes of the meeting, so carry on.
Okay, so this is from Beela Parish meeting. Robert Pillar. So 1, this objection to the application of Andreas Reginald Medler, reference 22311099, is the result of a residents' meeting held at Beela Hall on the 4th of May 2022, which was attended by 29 residents, representing 17 of the 32 households of the parish. All attendees, bar 1, wish to object to the application, and these objections are listed under the heading set out on the licensing website. Other objections, particularly environmental concerns, figured largely in the discussions, and residents were aware of the planning committee's conditions on the site and the fact that an enforcement notice has been served recently. This is a very brief summary of the major concerns expressed by residents who could see that the granting of this licence could lead to a major upheaval in the area. Obviously, number of have no reference to names or who.
Number of objections have no reference to names
And who
or
the objections are.
Yeah.
I believe numbers have been inflated once again. Quote, the fact that an enforcement notice has been served. This is untrue, and I would like to know where they have got this information from. And then
2.
conclusions. Residents find that most perturbing thing about the application is the lack of restrictions in a quiet rural area serving alcohol, running events 7 days a week for 13 hours a day, and no restriction on numbers involved cannot be accepted under any circumstances. Also, given that the council has had to serve an enforcement order on this site after promises were made to the planning committee that the site would have very little impact on local residents and the surrounding countryside, does not bode well for any restrictions being obeyed. So what impact to date has there been, and if any have been brought to my attention or the attention of others? Once again, there is no enforcement notice on Beela Country caravan site. So that's Robert Pillar.
Yeah, that's just 1 or 2 points that perhaps should be sort of clarified.
Did you want this one?
Yeah, and then Ben Budworth's objection.
So under the heading of prevention of crime and disorder, a caravan site, however well intended by the management, it is by its very nature open to a transient and itinerant clientele, whether travelling as a lifestyle or in holidaying mode.
Ms Medler, could I,
Yeah.
sorry to interrupt you,
No,
could I just let our solicitor come in with some advice?
Sorry.
Yes, can you, I know it's very complicated, the buttons.
Thank you. Are you intending, you seem to be reading through all of the objections, which obviously, I'm content if all you are doing is literally pulling out the relevant part of the objection and answering it as your evidence. But obviously, I don't want you really to go through all of the objections, because that would be a matter for questions at the appropriate time.
There's just one or two points that we'd like to try just to clarify.
Okay, as long as it's literally you're pulling out points and commenting on them, then I'm content if you carry on.
No, Mr Medler, we have established that there is no enforcement notice.
Yep.
Thank you.
So on the point of the transient clientele, whether travelling as a lifestyle, etc., as Mr. Budworth has put in his, under the heading of prevention of crime and disorder, please can they give more information to the meaning of the statement and why it is under the crime and prevention of crime and disorder. That's point one. Point two. You just like to read that?
Additionally, and more concern, the applicant has applied for all manner of outdoor event licence, which by their very nature must attract a certain demographic in numbers necessary to make the event commercially viable.
Yeah, you read.
Today, we have had private events and invited campers to join us with no charge. Maybe the type of event will not be big concerts with thousands of people and busloads of people as being portrayed. Costs are kept to a very minimal. People are invited from site to enjoy family-orientated evenings. 3, the land on which the caravan park is situated is open on 3 of the 4 sides, and civil trespassing across neighbouring land is already a recurring problem with the caravan site guests. The caravan park site is approximately 6 acres and is situated within the holdings of RG Medler Farming, which I am a part of, approximately 340 acres of Beela, where I have permission for people to pass over the tracks and enjoy the wildlife. 4, there have been a number of instances of the police having to attend the caravan site within the previous 24 months. We retain serious concerns as to public safety and therefore object to grant this licence. Can you give reference to what incidences you are referring to?
Next one.
Is that it, Ms Medler?
Bear with
One
me,
more.
sorry.
One
Okay.
more, sorry.
And we just have
This is
one
Bill
from
Borrett.
Bill Borrett. Mr Medler is currently subject to an enforcement notice from Breckland Council after a flagrant disregard of the planning conditions of the application for the campsite in question. This has led me, not unreasonably, to assume that any conditions surrounding the granting of a licence will be treated with the same disregard. Again, Andreas is not subject to an enforcement notice and would be very interested when Mrs Borrett got this information from. 2, Mr Medler has not proved to be a good neighbour and there has been numerous conflicts with all this near neighbouring, including intimidation. Would Mr Borrett like to clarify where these conflicts was with and about what, or was he just listening to hearsay from one or two people, as this statement is unfounded? Has Mr. Borrett acted without prejudice, as Andreas has never met the man nor spoke to him, nor has he visited the campsite, but was invited on the date but refused?
Thank you, Ms Medler. Have you finished?
Nearly there,
Okay,
sorry.
We
sorry.
could go through.
I'm not
the-
meaning to interrupt.
No, you're fine. We could go through the other objections, but I feel they are unfounded and generic and do not have any relevance to the licence application. We did invite everyone in the parish by letter to come and see us about the licence application to discuss any concerns they had before the parish council meeting. Only one person took the time to come and see us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms Medler. Before I open it up to the panel, Josie, could I just ask you a quick question relating to what we've just heard? About one of the complaints saying the police attending on numerous occasions. Are you aware of this?
Chairman, that information has certainly not been given to us by the police licensing authority. In fact, their submission, their response to the premises license application. Sorry, just trying to find the page for
I
you.
did see the notice from Chris Brooks
It is, yes. So it's on
saying that
page
they had no
18.
objections.
Yeah, it's on page 18 of the objection. If they had had concerns regarding police visits and issues around what would be considered to be licensable activities, I'm pretty certain that, I can't speak for him, but I am certain that he would have put that on his representation. So he
And-
may take his representation as read, as written.
That's what I hoped would be the case, Josie. And just to follow that up with, that have the licensing team received any complaints about the site?
No, we've not received any complaints about this.
Okay. Thank you, Josie. Heath, you got questions for the applicant?
Could I just ask you, you handed out these site rules and regulations. Are they all in current use? Yes. And adhere to? Yeah. Thank you. 7 years? Thank you.
Tristan?
Madam Chair, my question is going to be how long this campsite's been in operation, but that's already been answered.
Thank you. And that was one of my questions, Mr. Medler. If you've been in operation for 7 years, how many pitches do you have on the site for the public? And the site is limited to paying guests. And I imagine that on occasions, that those paying guests may have the occasional visitor or friend come and see them. Right, Mr. Medler, well, I have no further questions. Yeah, that's I'll just move across to my other page of notes. Mr. Medler, with this broad spectrum of your application, if you were having, let's say, a singer, a musical event, would that be restricted to, I'll use the word campers because I can't think of another word, would that be restricted to them and members of the public not allowed in?
Good question. I've got family. I've done so big of that, but it can't.
But the basis of it is, what I was trying to drive at is that any event that you put on would not be open to the public. It would be for your guests and any friends that they invited. And you would be willing to restrict that as a condition if necessary. Thank you. And because, as I said, members of the public, the application, as often happens, it's done on a general broad spectrum thing of, well, let's tick this box, let's tick that box, and so that, as has been said in some of the representations, by doing that, it means that you don't have to apply for a TENS notice, because you have given that broad spectrum of events and the broad spectrum of hours. It doesn't necessarily mean that that is what the applicant is intending to do. And that's actually what we're trying to bottom out here today, of what the applicant would, in all eventualities, wish to put on. So, Ms. Medler, would you like to just explain what you think might be put on at the campsite? And Mr. Medler, have you in the past had singers on the campsite?
Yes.
You have? And as we all know, especially depending on which direction the wind blows in, that sound does travel. But you haven't had any complaints up until now about singers on the campsite? And so it's your singers are not using what you might call hugely amplified music. It's more of a contained speaker. And so, Mr. Medler, would you be willing to, for instance, to remove the wrestling and boxing? Yes. Right, panel, do you have any more further questions, Mr. Medler?
If I could just ask you about some numbers, some clarification on numbers. You spoke about there being 50 pitches. Roughly how many people would that entail on average? And if they were to have guests that would also come over, what would you think was a reasonable amount of people to have on site at that time? Mhm.
I'm sorry, Julie. It was our fault.
done.
Sorry, did you have a question?
Mr. Medler, you've mentioned that you would be prepared to agree a restriction on numbers and number of events and types of events. Could you give us an idea of what you would actually agree to in terms of a restriction for that?
In relation to numbers of people?
Well, A, numbers of people, and B, the types of events, so, you know, plays, films, amplified music, and so on, the items that are in your, or regulated entertainment as you've included on your application. Because obviously you can amend your application and do this voluntary, or alternatively, the panel, if they were minded to grant the application, could impose conditions on you. It's obviously far better if we can agree voluntarily, and if you were to agree to amend your application, then obviously the panel can consider it. But have you any idea, have you thought about how you could restrict numbers, restrict events?
Yeah, I mean, sorry. The events, I mean, we sort of do things off the cuff as such. So if someone come along on site and they're a singer, and they volunteer to sing, they'll sing. There's not going to be nothing intrusive. So number of events, how many times are the kids going to sit there and watch a movie or something? Oh yeah. I don't know how many times people are going to sit there and watch a film, dance, etc., etc. So restricting the number of events is quite hard to put a number.
Thank you, Mr. Medler. And we'll now move on. And could I ask if any of the interested parties have any questions for the applicant? We'll start off with Councillor Borrett.
I perhaps like to make a clarification, Madam Chairman, because I was going to mention this when it got to my turn to speak, but the issue of the enforcement notice is entirely one of mine, because I was having had an initial conversation with the planning team. I misunderstood that an enforcement notice had been served, but they are currently still in the investigation part, and they haven't got as far as serving the notice. So a complaint has been made and officers are investigating it. I had a chat with the Director of Planning here at Breckland this morning, and the investigation is ongoing. So that's me jumping the gun on the issue of the notice, but there is certainly an investigation on the plan, non-fulfillment of the planning conditions of the original plan. That is what's happening. So I was incorrect in my submission. Apologise to the panel for misleading them, but it's entirely my mistake. Other than that, I've no questions from Mr. Miller.
Thank you, Councillor Borrett. I've got Mr. Pillar, yes?
Again. It's been stated that no invitation was given to the meeting held at Beeler Hall. Firstly, the meeting held at Beeler Hall originally was designed as a parish meeting. Beeler has no parish council, it only has a parish meeting. Everyone on the electoral roll was invited. That notice went out. Mr. Medler then phoned me and I apologised and said that as he was concerned with what the meeting was about, he obviously it would be quite good if he could come along to the meeting. There is no, I'm not obliged to ask other people, as far as I know from the meetings. as the people I need to invite to meetings are residents. And Mr. Medler is not a resident of Bela. But following his conversation, I then agreed to ask if an invitation could be sent to him, which Helen Budworth sent him an invitation, and he accepted the invitation. I have an email saying that he would come along. I have a later email where I am questioned continuously whether it is a public meeting or not. In the end, it couldn't be a proper parish meeting because I hadn't given enough notice. I have to give a week or even 2 weeks notice of a parish meeting. So in the end, because of the persistence on was this a public meeting, I actually cancelled the parish meeting and a meeting of residents was held, which I did not attend. Mr. Medler then declined to, well, sorry, had previously declined to attend. So the invitation was there, and at one point he was attending the meeting. As for the number of people who were at the meeting, I can categorically, I could, if necessary, supply the names of all the people who were there, and there were 29 residents, and as far as I know, from 17 of 34 households. To say I wasn't at the meetings, but those numbers are correct. The supporting hundreds that Mr. Medler could supply, where are they? I mean, the submissions come from residents who are residents of Bela Parish. Where are the hundreds of people who would support it? And it's easy to say you have hundreds of names, but we actually have named objections. I can come back to many points, but yes.
Thank you, Mr. Pillar. Can I
Oh,
just
sorry.
ask one question for clarification? If Mr. Medler doesn't live in Bela, where does he live? Oh, I'm sorry. I do apologise. I thought you were referring to the campsite and not to Mr. Medler. I do apologise.
Yes, as the campsite is in Bela.
Yeah.
And it is owned by Mr. Medler, I read from an interpreter that he should have been invited as an interested party. I did not have, there was no necessity for me to invite him, but out of politeness, it would have been a good idea initially to have invited him. I didn't, but in the conversation on the phone, I said that I would see what I could do. And an invitation was sent to him.
Thank you, Mr. Pillar. Yes, well, I mean, in the interest of transparency, I would hope that a meeting to discuss a person or a business is very helpful if they're there to answer questions.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Pillar. Do you have any questions for Mr. Pillar? Tristan? I do apologise. No, I have gone completely left field. We will return to the agenda. Mr. Hogger, do you have any questions for the applicant? Not at the moment.
My objections were so plainly written in our letter, but as has been said before, it's mainly the all-encompassing application which we were objecting to, but no other.
And could we move on to the gentleman next door, who's Michael, and I'm terribly sorry, I didn't get your
White.
surname.
It's White, W-H-I-T-E. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I've no questions at the moment, although I just want some clarification, given an event that took place over the last weekend. There was quite a lot of amplification coming across the fields. And I just wondered what that was. Saturday night, Friday night, last week, 28th. There was a band, I believe. Right. And we're what, a mile or so away from the main part of the campsite. We could clearly hear the noise coming across. And you know my objections, Andreas. It's the scope and nature of the application, not having any checks and balances or any parameters being laid down. And you made mention earlier on that it would simply be a busker type singer there for the benefit of the campers. However, having experienced the amplification coming across the fields over the weekend, I would be seriously concerned about a couple of hours. Yeah, occasionally over the last couple of years. I wouldn't say it was obtrusive on past occasions, but certainly, noise drifts a long distance, particularly at night, and particularly without any noise baffles in the way. Yeah, I don't think that's relevant to your application, but yeah. I'm quite happy with sheep, but bands being, going on until late in the evening, that's not something that I am comfortable with. I think it went on to about 10:30, 11 o'clock. Yeah, but can you clarify, given what you had said earlier about there not being any amplification intended under your license, as to why there was amplification this last weekend?
So there wasn't going to be amplified music. Most music is amplified, unfortunately. That's the nature of singing, etc., etc. Don't quite understand where you're sort of leading to as such.
The concerns of the residents are quite simple. It's noise levels, it's light pollution, it's public disorder. What we witnessed over the weekend was quite loud noise. Well, given the proximity to this meeting, I thought it appropriate to raise it now rather than make a separate complaint. But no, I don't have the facilities to measure noise. I simply know what I heard and what I experienced. And we had taken to our beds early that evening, and it disturbed our sleep.
Mr. White, thank you for your question. Could I ask our solicitor just to offer some advice regarding the music?
Yes, certainly. Under the Deregulation Act, amplified music, recorded music is not a licensable activity. So Mr. Andreas Mr. Medler is entitled to allow music of that ilk between certain times, which it's between 8 in the morning and 11 at night, subject to certain numbers, so it wouldn't be a licensed activity. But we can obviously consider conditions, etc., that could restrict numbers and events, which was obviously what I was discussing with Mr. Medler earlier. But in itself, amplified music, recorded music is not a licensable activity.
Thank you. In my objection, I did put forward suggestions, and I would be quite happy to support a limited and restricted amount of activity in terms of music, magic shows, film shows for kids, the sale of alcohol on a restricted basis to campers. I'm not trying, and I don't think anybody here is trying to restrict Mr. Medler's commercial activities.
Dealing with questions to the applicant. Do you mind if we just stick to the question to the
Sure.
applicant? And then
Okay,
obviously,
thank you.
You can make your points through your representative or spokesperson at the appropriate time, if you don't mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Ms. Hawkins, do you have any questions for the applicant?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Yes, I have a couple. Do I address the chair or Mr. Medler directly?
Mr. Medler, it's fine.
Okay. Was the music amplified on Saturday night? Okay. And what time did the music finish? Okay. Am I allowed to disagree with that? Because at 10:35, we could clearly hear Bon Jovi being blared out. I don't say your address. I don't know exactly how far, but we
We're
could.
the
clearly
furthest
hear.
property on Beeler Estate.
We're the furthest property away. Was the music live or recorded on Saturday?
Right, thank you, Ms. Hawkins. Was that your only question?
I did have one other.
No, carry on.
Concern, and that was about the rather vague answer that Mr. Medler gave earlier about the types of events, and the when there is a vagueness around what events are going to be put on and by whom, and they might actually be quite impromptu events, that doesn't allow much time to actually put in extra controls to that event. I'm thinking about numbers of people turning up, and it makes it difficult. It makes it difficult to control events if there's not adequate time for planning. So I am concerned that there seems to be an apparent lack of control, and it seems to be quite freestyle. So.
What sort of things? Just control.
Well, you mentioned about a singer coming on site, and you might or might not be putting on light entertainment, and there may or may not be screens for the children. And these events are, as I understand it, all meant to be outside. And I'm thinking, what about electricity and being outside, and if it rains? And yeah. I'm sorry, I'm probably drifting off a bit, but I wasn't getting the overall impression that this was being controlled by yourselves. It was more a freestyle event that may or may not happen. And in terms of the our concerns, if please may I finish? Our concerns mirror the other concerns already raised. which is about there's no apparent restrictions on the types of events, the numbers of days that they will be held, and the times and the durations. And I do want to just give a balancing point. We can clearly hear Caders Hill and the motocross racing that takes place. We haven't complained about that because we know it's only going to be 1 or 2 weekends, maybe 3 weekends in a summer. It's clearly advertised when it's going to be, so we know in advance. So, and you know, you hear the motorbikes buzzing around. That's fine. It starts at 9 o'clock and it finishes around about 3 o'clock. So it gives some context and some boundaries to that mild interference, let's say. And I think the lack of boundaries we have with the application has been one of our biggest concerns, because we don't know whether we're dealing with something that is going to be quite small and controlled, or something that's going to be quite large and wild and quite noisy. So,
well, sorry, that's not the subject of this application. So,
we haven't
Mrs.
heard.
Hawkins, can I just say, obviously, it's questions of the applicant at this stage. Have you got any further questions? And then obviously the comments you're making, I think it's more appropriate to make when you obviously present your objections.
No, I don't have any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Hawkins. Mr. Hawkins?
Thank you.
We move on to Mr. and Mrs. Budworth. Thank you very much.
Madam Chairman, thank you. I only have one question and a request that it isn't answered with another question, please, Mr. Medler. On how many occasions, please could you show some interest, have you actually entertained 500 people up at the Beela Country Park and Caravan site? Yes, of course I can. On how many occasions in the last 7 years have you had 500 guests at the Beela Park camping and caravan site? My initial question was to ask whether you would not ask a question in return. Please answer the question. That is not an answer to a question. It is indeed relevant, because I believe that you are taking the committee to extremes. And yes, if you have 50 pitches, I find it highly unlikely that you would have 6 occupants per pitch. Therefore, I suspect the maximum number that the campsite is capable of handling would be more like 150. I would have serious concerns were 500 people on that caravan site at any one time. It's clear to me that Mr. Medler cannot answer the question. It's clear to me that 500 people would be of serious concern to the police and the licensing committee in terms of crime and disorder. And I believe that you're being misled to think that 500 people could sit on that caravan site under any circumstances with any degree of security whatsoever.
Mr. Budworth, perhaps for clarification, where does this figure of 500 people come from?
I'm sorry, I
Were
overstated
you
it.
saying 499 in jest, Mr. Medler?
I was asked for the figure.
Well, I think we could all probably assume, which we never should, that that was a little misleading. So I would ask Mr. Budworth.
Yes.
What is the? Do you have any figures of attendance of the public at the campsite over the years? Are there any large figures?
No, Madam Chairman, I have no figures. I would assume that, bearing in mind that the rules and the risk assessments that have been mentioned, Mr. Medler has a table of attendances going back a number of years, and I would suspect that there, at no point have there been more than 150 people on site. And I would steer the committee towards a figure more akin to 100 to 150 rather than 500 people in Beela. I mean, that's 10 times the size of the parish in its population. This is turning towards a thing. If I could also perhaps draw the committee's attention to the list of rules here.
Sorry, have you got a question for the?
Yes, I have. Perhaps the applicant could clarify at the bottom of his list of rules, when it says visitors, all visitors must sign in at reception. A small surcharge may apply. Exactly how, Mr. Medler, does that differ from a ticketing process that for an event that you might be planning to hold? There is no mention here that all visitors need to be friends or relations of the campers. And a small surcharge, to my mind, is indeed the price of a ticket or admission charge.
Mr. Budworth, of course you can, Mr. Medler.
Thank you.
You've got a planned event at the hall summertime. What numbers of people are you envisaging coming to Beela Hall? Well, I'm just trying to make the point where he's trying to restrict my business, and in relation to all these people coming to my caravan site, yet he's got events planned. So I'm just asking what sort of numbers would be going to that, and in relation to a small surcharge may apply in my rules and regulations.
Mr. Medler, I think it might help the panel, it'd certainly help me, if you could clarify the maximum number of people that you would expect to be on your site at any one occasion.
Good question. In relation to guests, etc., etc. Pictures times that by 6 or 8.
I good at maths off the top of my head.
I mean, if I said 500, that's not going to exceed 500. Maybe 250, 300 people.
Well, I think that's still a bit vague, Mr. Medler, but it's something that can be bottomed out with conditions. But thank you for asking. You're still a bit vague, and I'm not very clear about it. We'll move on to Mrs. Budworth. You're fine. Right. According to the procedures, this is where the interested parties, responsible authorities now have the opportunity to make their objections and presentations in accordance with the licensing objectives. So could we start off with Councillor Borrett?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I'll be brief. I've been the elected member since 2007 for Upper Wensum Ward, and this is the first time I have attended a licensing hearing. So this is quite unusual, and the amount of energy and concern is the largest I've ever had since I've been elected. So I'm here today to reflect the concerns of the residents as they have made them to me. I wanted to correct my mistake about the issue of the enforcement notice, which was mine, and I apologise to the committee for that. So I still think there is an issue around whether the applicant is going to be interested in any restrictions or to the application. So I am concerned about that. I do think that this site isn't miles from anywhere. It's on the top of a hill. It's not really, you can't really see that from the Google site. So it is quite a prominent site and as a result, sound and nuisance travel. A number of residents, Mr. Medler made a point that I said that there had been numerous conflicts with his near neighbours. I have had quite a lot of information from people who have not wanted to come forward. So therefore I understand that it's not material because they're not here to say themselves. But what I would like to assure the committee is that I'm not making it up. And that's part of the reason I'm here. The parish is a small one. And Mr. Medler said that I had refused to come to the site, and that is quite true because I know the site, and in fact I was on the planning committee here at Breckland when the original application was put in, and we did a site visit with Elizabeth Gould, who was the chairman of the planning committee at the time. One of the conditions is that the applicant doesn't live on the site, so there isn't provision for residential oversight of this site, so nobody is actually living there and able to therefore 24 hours a day supervise what is happening there. And that was a specific condition of the planning permission. And that is, I assume, why Mr. Medler isn't a resident of Beela, and that's why he wasn't on the parish register and therefore called to the parish meeting. I did say to Mr. Medler that he could speak to me, and I did send him my home telephone number so that if he wanted to speak to me about the application, I'd be very happy. And I said in my email, I'd be very happy to engage in a conversation with him. So I don't want the committee to think that I refuse to engage with Mr. Medler. And that's enough for me, I think, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Bont. It's very interesting. When you say that the original application, that there is no accommodation for the owner. So I shouldn't be asking you, I should be asking Mr. Medler. Is Mr. Medler, who is on site for the time that your resident's there?
There's security on site.
Security, what's that? And where are the staff living?
There's
Sorry?
there's the staff there.
Yes, I was just asking what kind of accommodation, if the staff are there 24/7,
Yeah,
what kind of accommodation they had?
caravan.
And how many staff?
There's myself, a good lady. Two of my daughters and I come on board, working for us. So we split the night duties between us, etc. So it's a family-run business.
And so between you, there is always somebody on site.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Medler. And we move on to Mr. Miller.
A lot of what I was already going to say was read out to you. It's a rejection, but so apologies if it's a repeat. The main objection is residents find the most perturbing thing about this application is the lack of restriction. In a quiet rural area, serving alcohol and running events 7 days a week for 13 hours a day. And I'm not saying it's happening, but the possibility is there for it to happen if there are no controls. No restriction on numbers. I mean, I'm very perturbed by the consideration that 500 would be an acceptable number of people to attend an event at a small caravan site off a minor road, at just the will of maybe a singer turns up. You know, I'm not quite convinced about what the controls of access to that site to the public would be. And in fact, the whole application, I don't think in the application, whilst it mentions children's events and things like that, the option is there for it to be as broad as he wants. So I'm not sure what the controls, if 500 people turned up, would be. Sorry, going back to this. The objection that I submitted on behalf of Beela Parish meeting was from a residents meeting in the event. There were 29 residents there, but there are only 62 people on my electoral row. And 29 of them turned up at a meeting at which all bar one of the people there objected on one ground or another. Right, so what were the specific objections? Under prevention of public nuisance, concerns of the residents were that there was an area, Beela Park, noted for its quiet and peaceful surroundings. That's one of the selling points for the caravan park, is the quiet nature of the place. And to be perfectly fair, if you look at the reviews for the campsite, they are very, very good. So they obviously run a very good site and satisfy their customers at the moment with what they're doing at the moment. But Beela is a very quiet and small rural parish. And I just don't know what 500 people arriving on an unknown day would do and might. There's concern that the granting of the license as applied for could create the potential for major noise disturbance, increased light pollution in the area, and considerably the traffic situation is a major concern. So that's under prevention of public nuisance, prevention of crime and disorder, the potential for sale of alcohol 13 hours a day and 7 days a week. Now, Mr. Medler might say, oh, he's only going to open a certain number of hours, but that is not in the application. There is no limitation within that application. And it then comes down to what Mr. Medler says he will do. There are no restrictions, and that is the main concern of the residents of Beela.
Thank you, Mr. Hogger.
I'm
sorry. I think that, as I mentioned before, when the meeting has finished, that conditions can be put in place. And yes, of course.
That I would have no objections as long as I knew what the event was, what the controls were, and that it wasn't going to be every week, every Saturday night, fish and chips and a singer. If I know that, and it's going to be limited to residents of the campsite, then I would find it hard to object to something like that. But it's the unknown nature of what Mr. Medler might decide to put on that is my own personal concern and the concern of the lot.
Thank you, Mr. Pillar. Well, myself and the panel will certainly take all your points on board for consideration. And as I said, we can certainly put conditions on. Before we move to the next gentleman, who I will get the name right, Mr. Hogger, I will come back to Mr. Medler just to say the application because it's so broad, Mr. Medler, has thrown up a major number of concerns. I realise why. You might have ticked all the boxes, because it would then save coming forward for a 10's notice at a occasion when you wanted to put some specific event on. It may be that you wish to consider not applying for the amount of things that you have, like indoor sporting events, boxing and wrestling, and performance of dance, anything of a similar description. It might be that you would wish to consider not applying for those and coming for a 10's notice for a special event if and when you wanted to put it on. But I'm generalizing there, so we will move on to Mr. Hogger to see what he wishes to say.
Could I just confirm with Mr. Madler that there's only one entrance and exit to the site for vehicles at the present time? So if you're talking of a possible 300, 500, would they all have to enter that one entrance off the main road and also leave from that entrance as well? That there isn't a second exit. There is only one entrance and exit, only one.
The campsite.
To the campsite. So for all events, they all have to come in one entrance and leave by the same exit. Okay, thank you. Thanks, Madam Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. White.
I've nothing really to add to Mr. Pillar's presentation. Safe to say that I simply want to endorse my own objections that I submitted to the licensing team, and to say that subject to various restrictions being put in place as to noise, numbers, etc., I would support what Mr. Medler is trying to achieve in terms of running his business and extending entertainment to his campus, but on a very restricted basis. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. White. Ms. Hawkins.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I've just got 5 points I'd like to raise, please. First of all, part of our objection is that the application is too broad. Number two, there is no business case for the events that are likely to be put on. It's very vague. There's no numbers involved, which would be helpful. Number three, we've already experienced trespassers from campers who were given a map that they were following to go on a circular walk, which took them onto land where they had no permission to walk. And this happened on 3 separate occasions in May of last year. And number four, the events that Mr. Medler is looking to put on, I believe, are all outdoors. Because number 5, my point is, there is, I don't believe, to be a building in which these events are going to be held. So I'm not sure how that impacts on the sale of alcohol, whether there will be a bar or an outdoor bar or something. But I'm just curious how that would fall under sort of the hygiene regs, or what the intentions are around the sale of alcohol, whether it's from a shop or from a bar, because again, that's not clear. So yes,
Thank you for that. Could I ask Josie Hoven, the licensing officer who visited, if she could advise us on the concerns of where the alcohol will be sold from? Will there be a bar?
Thank you, Chairman. So I did visit the site, and I also have a plan that shows that was part of the application that the alcohol is to be stored and sold from the reception. Upon visiting, it is in one fridge. There are 2 shelves available, but it's not a massive fridge. And it is therefore selling, my understanding is, for sale to people attending the campsite, to prevent them having to get in their cars, leave the site and go to one of the local shops, when perhaps they may have already had some alcohol or not, but it's there to be sold to members of the campsite. But it is technically in bottles, I believe, although I believe Mr. Medler will be able to confirm that. It's not a bar type situation currently. However, as it is on sales, it would not prevent him from doing that later on.
And what kind of building is the reception, Josie?
Brick building, I believe. That's what I saw. It's a main reception area where I believe people check in. Mr. Medler would probably be best to confirm what type of building it is. I went inside it. It's a small reception area. As I say, there was a refrigerator that had milk and butter and I believe some groceries and bread was available. And some soft drinks, and that was it on the day that I visited.
Thank you, Josie. Mr. Medler, and as far as the license of alcohol sales, if you've got a small fridge there at the moment in reception, where do you envisage the storage of this alcohol?
The storage will be within reception area. There's storage area for paperwork, etc., which is not accessible to the public. So that's where alcohol would be stored, and then on sale in reception.
And Mr. Medler, is it your intention to have what one might call a bar for residents to sit at whilst they're drinking alcohol, or is it your intention that they take it back to their caravans or tents?
Once they've brought the alcohol, if they go back to their tents, that's where they'll drink, or caravans. We've got a small communal area, so perhaps they'd like to sit and socialise amongst themselves, etc.
So you do not have any intention of providing a bar for them to sit at?
No. In relation to bar, as in a fixed bar in a building, for them to say, is that what you're saying?
Well, let me rephrase it. An area where people can gather together indoors and have a drink. Is that your intention or is that not your intention?
My intention.
Thank you, Mr. Medler. And it's Mr. Hawkins, yes? Mr. and Mrs. Hudworth.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I think it's important that from the residents' point of view, we stress to Mr. Medler that this is not in any way the residents being pejorative or trying to do down his business. No one is keener to see his business thrive and his caravan site continue to be a centre of excellence than the existing residents. What we implore the licensing committee to do is to allow Mr. Medler to see that an open application is in no one's best interests. And might we suggest that, to begin with at any rate, the idea of simply licensing alcohol on sales to existing residents of the campsite and bona fide guests to number no more than, say, 50, because not everyone at the campsite is going to have a guest. And that already takes you up to 200 or so potential people. But keeping the numbers restricted is surely the way forward, and to push the events to tens notices for the time being, and look at that in a year or two's time to see how the events have panned out, how the film shows that were initially for children might have grown to be for adults, how music has suited or not suited the neighbourhood, but to take steps into this licensing process and not dive headlong into the pool, which we all then will realise is too shallow in the neighbourhood to do anything but bump our head with. That concludes my objection and my wife's objection. Thank you.
The both of you.
Yes, Madam Chairman, I have no further. statement.
That's lovely.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Budworth. Very well put. Members of the panel. Keith, do you have any questions for the members of the public or Councillor Borrett?
Well, can I do one to the main on the rules there was locked at the gates at 11 o'clock. Do you have any experience of the main gates being locked overnight? It makes me think that guests have come on, and then if it's going on later, how do they sort of go home, or would they be staying overnight? You don't know.
Sorry, I don't know. I very seldom drive past that way, if I'm honest. There are other ways to Portsmouth. But as I say, I've never experienced any problems with the site. But that's with current numbers. You know, if even 50 people, you know, there must be a limit to how many people are actually there. The number of friends who visit, if you're going to go up to numbers like 200, you know, they got to leave the site. And I don't know. Safety, drink driving, I don't know. But I've no experience with myself, so I cannot say that is a concern.
Tristan.
Just to say that the clarification in the objective. Just one point I wanted to clarify. Mr. White, is your objection in the pack? Because I can't find it.
Yes, it is. I filled in an online form.
It's my oversight. I found it. Thank you.
Is that your only question, Tristan? Okay. So, Mr. Medler, do you have any questions you'd like to ask the members of the public and Councillor Borrett?
We applied for the premises license just to tick the boxes in relation to what we may do in the future, etc. And we're not there to have raves, 5,000 people, as Mr. Borrett said, and as Mr. Pillar went round when he was delivering his leaflet to someone saying there's coachloads of people coming, there's going to be concerts, etc., etc.
Sorry, Mr. Medler, was that a question?
Well, in your
Could you
meetings-
rephrase it as a question, Mr. Medler?
Yeah. In your meetings, etc., have you sort of escalated things from just a simple license application to the train, there's going to be 5,000 people and concerts and raves.
No, Mr. Medler, I think
I
probably,
think that isn't on. in the
possibly,
objections.
I could
So-
offer some clarification on that. As I've
Yeah.
mentioned before, Mr. Medler, the challenge here is that the application is so broad.
Yeah.
But I'm
yeah,
quite sure that
I gather
the
that.
panel can look at
Everyone-
that. And as I said, if you were open to considering restricting or removing, which we can deal with later.
Yeah,
As I
brilliant.
said, things like boxing and wrestling, indoor sports, you know, performance of dance, you've
The-
already agreed to that. So
There's,
yes, councillor
The-
Barrett.
The line, I think, is that line in my letter was the license that he is applying for is 13 hours a day, 7 days a week, 12 months of the year for gatherings up to 5,000 people. NB, they do not have to be staying at the site. So that's where that figure comes from, because I understand that that is the scope of the license that is technically being applied for. I didn't say that it was Mr. Medler's intention to have 5,000 people. I said that was the scope of the license he was applying for, and that the people didn't have to be staying on the site.
Well, thank you for the clarification, councillor Barrett. I'm sure, Mr. Medler, that we can discuss the conditions that may be able to be put in place to appease the concerns of members of the public. Yes, Mr. Medler.
Mr. Medler, you have an opportunity to sum up in a minute. Do you mind just limiting this current time to questioning if you have any questions for the objectors, and then we can move on to yours summing up?
no, that's fine.
Okay.
No questions.
Right, thank you, Mr. Medler. Mr. Medler, would you like to speak again and sum up? If you'd like to switch your microphone on, please.
Just summing up the events we're looking to actually have, we probably don't actually need any license in relation to the events. Obviously, the sale of alcohol, yes, the license would be good. And private events, I believe there is no restrictions on numbers. So I'm trying to be as open as I can to everyone. So I could have a private party, have 5,000 people to a private party, and I could have that every weekend. And then obviously you would then have to chase the authorities to try and restrict the private parties. I'm not looking for raves, big parties, etc. Everyone have private parties and always travel. Oh, so the barracks, sometimes they have things on, perhaps hear them. The lads on the local heath have car stereos going. People in Broadswell, the villagers there have events, you'd probably hear them. So that's the nature of events. Unfortunately, noise does travel.
So, Mr. Medler, if I,
So
because it's your opportunity, as I said, to speak again and sum up. If you perhaps could just, I know that you haven't been given any time to think about this or discuss it with your daughter, but if you would be willing to say to the panel and to the members of the public and Councillor Barrett, what you would most definitely wish to apply for on this application. And I understand that the sale of alcohol would obviously be one of the ones
yeah,
that you wanted to apply for.
I mean, the alcohol license is to prevent people potentially leaving the site after consuming some of their own alcohol in search of more alcohol. We can't control it, but at the same time, I won't shy away from my duty of care to everyone else on site and to the public. So if someone's had, they can bring as much alcohol as they like on site. I can't control that. By having alcohol on sale on site, hopefully we can prevent people leaving site in search of more alcohol if they feel the need to. So in my eyes, that's been responsible to everyone. Music. Yeah, music, that's quite nice. But everyone on site enjoying an evening's entertainment, kids' films, etc., adults' films, evenings, daytime films. That's. I don't think you'll be hearing kids' films or anything else. And even if there was a big film company coming, a lot of us know Wi-Fi streams, we have earphones, etc. But that's not going to be happening.
We follow our rules, everything's quiet outside.
Light pollution, we minimise our lights on site, so not to interfere with light pollution. That's why the campsite isn't lit up. Only the toilet and the reception is lit up. Yet we could light up the whole field, but we don't. So,
So, Mr. Medler, would you and your family be willing, and I'm not wishing to put words into your mouth at all, as far as the application is concerned, would you be willing for the indoor sporting events to be removed, the boxing or wrestling entertainments to be removed, the performance of dance, which could be cats on the stage or something like that? That's another one that you might consider, to be removed, which then drops your application more down into the supply of alcohol. And if you could reassure us that you would not be encouraging vast numbers of people who weren't paying residents on the site, that you would not be encouraging them to come to the site in the evening, partaking in the alcohol which you sell in the shop, because I hear the concerns of the residents, and I think it needs boxing up a little bit tighter.
yep, I hear what you're saying. The intention was not to have raves, parties, etc., etc. The intention is just for light entertainment. We don't want to invite loads of people on site. I don't want to spoil my business. I ain't quite lost my mind.
Well, I think I hear from many of the residents here that that they support your business, but what they're concerned about is what it might morph into. If we could just be assured that it wasn't going to morph into something, that it would continue probably as it is at the moment, with some live music or some buskers, plus the sale of alcohol, limited to reasonable hours so as not to disturb the public. Would you be content with that?
Yeah, that's
Well, let me come back to our licensing officer, who's the expert on these things.
I wouldn't like to be considered an expert, Madam Chairman, thank you, just for the record. I would, if it's possible, like to ask the applicant a question, and that is, Mr. Medler, what times of the year is the campsite allowed to be open? Is there a restriction on when it can be open? It's not, so it's a 12 months a year campsite. Okay. The other thing I would like to point out to all parties present is that under the Deregulation Act, the provision of live and recorded music. Again, we're looking at the hours of 8 AM to 11 PM, which falls within the times that the applicant has applied for, because that's 10 AM to 11 PM. Is actually allowed as long as the audiences are not more than 500 people. That also covers the performance of a play or dance. So as the applicant has said that he wouldn't be exceeding, I believe he said 499 people, he would actually be covered under the deregulation. So it's to make it clear to all parties that actually that is allowed regardless of whether a license is issued today or not. It's just to make everything clear and open and transparent. So the performance of play and dance, musical entertainment, indoor sporting events are actually limited to 1,000 spectators, but as there is no indoor facility, obviously that wouldn't be applicable then. But it's just to make that clear. So it is really, from the applicant's point of view, the sale of alcohol that is the issue here, and obviously tightening up with the respect of the other members present, their concerns.
Josie, that's very helpful. Thank you very much indeed. Yes.
I'm not able to answer that question because I don't work in the environmental protection team. There are regulations in place for working. So if you work within a certain distance of speakers, etc., I do know that that exists. However, what I would say is at the moment, there haven't been any representation from the environmental protection team. If there were concerns, and I think it's important at this stage to probably also note that there is a review process. So if a license is granted today, and there are issues even around those other things that are covered under the Deregulation Act that would become potentially a licensable activity, there is a review process for the license. So it's not a done deal that if a license were granted today, that's it, it's carte blanche. If there are issues, then obviously we go down the route of mediation. We will always try and work with both parties. But the final result of that is that if we're not able to sort that out, there is a review process, and that can be called by any party. It could be a responsible authority, or it could be a member of the public, a resident, etc. And that's where those objections or those concerns would come back to the committee as a part of a review process. So an application for review would need to be submitted. But I just want to assure you, it's not a case of a license is granted and that's it. You're stuck with what happens. There's a review process to that license, should it be required further down the line. I think the solicitor would confirm that. Again, that's not relevant to the application for a premises license. That's a different set of regulations that come under health and safety. So it's not covered. We purely deal with licensable activities at the licensing committee. So I can't answer that question. That would come under health and safety, and they would have to meet those regulations under that set of regulations.
Josie, that's very helpful. Your advice on policy and law or jurisdiction. So Sarah, do you have anything to add?
Nothing further.
Right. Keith, do you have any further questions? Tristan? No? Right. Everybody, Josie's finished. So thank you, everyone. Could I ask that you could leave the room now while the panel make the decision? There's tea and coffee outside, and the toilets are on the right-hand side. Please make yourself as comfortable as possible, and we'll try not to keep you waiting too long.